Okay, we'll start in a minute or two. If you could find your seats, those of you that are just coming into the room, please. All right. Welcome all of you to the University of Wisconsin Law School for this year's edition of really one of the most important events in the intellectual and also, I hope, social life of the law school, the Fairchild Lecture, named after Judge Thomas Fairchild, who is able to be with us today. Judge, welcome to you in particular. It is my... It is a treat, as always, to have you and your family with us, as well as the many of your former law clerks who are the inspiration for this lecture and who've organized it and helped coordinate it so successfully over the years. We are indeed quite fortunate to have with us today as the Fairchild Lecturer Professor Elizabeth Warren, who is the Leo Gottlieb Professor of Law at the Harvard Law School. She is the author or co-author of numerous books and articles, including several large empirical studies of the business and consumer bankruptcy system. Her book, As We Forgive Our Debtors, Bankruptcy and Consumer Credit in America, published by the Oxford University Press in 1989, reports on the first of these studies, and for it, she was awarded the 1990 Silver Gavel Award by the American Bar Association and was a finalist for the award of Outstanding Book in 1990 in Sociology. Her most recent book, The Fragile Middle Class, Americans in Debt, is also an award winner, and it expands the reach of her bankruptcy research into related areas, including employment stability, healthcare finance, and mortgage lending. Professor Warren was the advisor to the National Bankruptcy Review Commission and served by the appointment of Chief Justice William Rehnquist as the only non-judge on the Federal Judicial Center's Education Committee. She is an outstanding teacher, a wonderful friend of this law school for several decades, or a couple of decades, I should put it that way. Excuse me, yes, since her childhood. And she has won awards for excellent teaching at Harvard and 4 other universities where she has taught. So please join me in welcoming back to the law school Professor Elizabeth Warren.
Thank you very much. I am deeply honored to be invited to deliver this year's Fairchild Lecture. Judge Fairchild holds a very special place in the hearts of those in the legal profession and those in the legal academy. It is a singular pleasure to be given the opportunity to honor the judge and for just one moment to speak for all those who would express their appreciation and their admiration for his years of service to the causes of justice. Thank you for having me here. Thank you. I am particularly pleased to be at the University of Wisconsin. The last time I spoke here was many years ago. I did not get the job. But I'm resilient. Notwithstanding rejection, I have long regarded the University of Wisconsin as a kind of philosophical home. This is the very place where empirical questions are framed, where law and is honored, and where creative, iconoclastic ideas are born. Stuart Macaulay and Bill Whitford and Mark Galanter and Lawrence Friedman and Dave Trubeck and Kidwell and lots of people have been my teachers and tormentors throughout my professional career. To come to the University of Wisconsin to talk about the role of social sciences in shaping law is worse than carrying coals to Newcastle or cheese to Wisconsin. Wisconsin is, after all, the place that pioneered the integration of social sciences and law. Nonetheless, with all the good sense that I showed the last time I spoke here, I plunge ahead. My field is bankruptcy and commercial law, and I have been a principal investigator on 5 major data collection projects. My current research is a kind of hub and spokes work with a core of data about families in financial trouble. And I'm trying to integrate these bankruptcy data into public policy debates in a variety of areas, including debates over government policies about housing, about the fallout of our healthcare finance system, about disincentives for small businesses and entrepreneurs, and about the increasing vulnerability, economic vulnerability of women heads of household. If I succeed, all sorts of people in other academic fields who have never thought much about bankruptcy or about 11 U.S.C. 1329 B2II will become more familiar with how middle-class families are trying and all too often failing to cope with a changing economic and social landscape. With that background, I know where you think that I will go. I should begin my speech with a citation to Peter Schuck's famous Yale Law Review article, lamenting the lack of social science research in the academy, noting Wisconsin, of course, is the glorious exception. I should then cite the many academic papers that call for more empirical research. I should note that even the high theorists in law and economics movement call for more data, presumably to be done by the worker bees instead of by themselves, but at least they make the call. After that introduction, I should then beat the drum vigorously for the importance of empirical research, lament the lack of financial support for such work, complain about how hard empirical research is, and congratulate myself with appropriate subtlety for being one of those poor, unappreciated Stakhanovites. We could then break for cocktails. I hate to disappoint, but I'm not here to sing that song, although I do love every verse. Peter Schuck's plea for law professors to do more empirical research has been echoed by more than 24 scholars in the past decade. The dearth of data lamented in each article implies a sort of vacuum of information, a world without prior research. They seem to suggest a world that, if not breathlessly awaiting data pronouncements from the academy, is at least willing to be happily surprised by hard information that will enlighten and transform. There is, in fact, already a thriving market for empirical research. Journalists are hungry for facts to pepper their reports. Lobbyists are eager to promote helpful facts in their lobbying and discredit unhelpful facts. There are some in Congress who are assembling facts to support foregone conclusions. In this market, empiricists face a new and very dangerous world. What I'm going to do today is not quite a blues song, but it isn't a Sousa march either. I confess at the outset to substantial bait and switch in this paper. The title is Social Sciences, but I'll talk almost exclusively about empirical research, principally about quantitative work. The title is also law, but I'll speak about the very small part of law that I know, the world of bankruptcy and commercial law. I have no excuse except that I had to write the title before I had to write the paper, and I suffer from a severe optimism bias about what it is that I can accomplish. Of course, optimism bias is why I do empirical work too. Today I'm going to focus on statutory law. I have a long defense of the importance of statutory law, but I'll condense it in a 15-second voice vote. Legislatures can overrule common law doctrines and entire lines of policy that have been developed by courts over decades or even centuries. For much public policy work today, statutes are where the action is, and that's where I'm going to put my focus now. Empirical data are valuable in shaping laws, and I'll tell you where I get my evidence for this. The evidence comes from the fact that a growing number of corporations and lobbying groups are paying to produce such data so that they can use it to lobby legislatures and influence public opinion. Those who want to achieve a victory in the legislative arena have decided that a spoonful of data helped the lobbying go down. In 1978, the bankruptcy laws were modernized. You need a little history to understand this one. They were modernized so that families in financial trouble would have a better chance to deal with overwhelming consumer debt and to protect themselves from the most aggressive of credit collection practices. The consumer credit industry was able to block some provisions in that 78 law, but by and large, they saw the liberalization as a defeat of their own interests. In the early 1980s, the industry regrouped to launch an assault on Congress to amend the 1978 code to be more pro-creditor. The industry used all the typical devices, campaign contributions, press releases, lobbying visits to Washington, and so on. They also made an important financial contribution to Purdue University's Krannert School of Business, the Credit Research Center as it's known. In return, the Credit Research Center self-published an empirical study of consumer bankruptcy. The study concluded that about $1.1 billion in debt was discharged annually by families that file for bankruptcy when in fact they could have repaid their debts. Now, the study was never published as a book, a scholarly article, or even a news article. It was not available in ordinary academic channels, nor could most libraries find it. But every member of Congress received a personal copy, hand-delivered as part of an information package prepared by the blue-chip advertising agency Ogilvy and Mather. The 1982 CRC study bore the imprint of Purdue University and its business school. In 1984, Congress gave the credit industry what it wanted, a series of amendments that eroded somewhat the protections granted to troubled families in the 1978 Code. There were a lot of factors at work in 1984 legislation, and I would never claim to prove causation, but I'll use a market test, as I've been taught to do. The credit industry spent a substantial sum of money to develop the 1982 CRC study, and then even more money to hire a very fancy public relations firm in order to circulate it to Congress. Industry strategists obviously believed that the data were worth the price they had paid for them because they returned to the source. The credit industry's appetite to change the bankruptcy laws was whetted by the 1984 changes, but not satisfied. In the early 1990s, the industry went on the offensive again. What was going on is that consumer credit was highly profitable. It has been throughout the last 2.5 decades, staggeringly profitable. But the banks were engaged in a marketing frenzy. As debts rose, so rose the number of bankruptcies. The industry believed that by curtailing bankruptcy filings, they could help maximize profits while they continued to expand their consumer lending to an ever more marginal set of borrowers. A few key senators in the early 1990s held off amending the code, offering in place of the amendments the National Bankruptcy Review Commission. That commission was to make a recommendation to Congress, and that commission was headed by a Madison lawyer who also teaches here at the University of Wisconsin Law School, Brady Williamson. When it became clear in the course of the commission's work that the commission would not embrace the credit industry proposals as the industry had certainly planned, industry lobbyists went back to their friends in Washington, prompting them to propose a new pro-creditor bill. The credit industry's lobbying soon outstripped the spending of every other special group in Washington. Financial services outspent the traditional big spenders, tobacco, pharmaceuticals, and oil. In 2000 alone, MBNA, the country's largest credit card issuer, through its executives, its PACs, and soft money pledges, was the single biggest contributor to George Bush's presidential campaign. Also in 2000 alone, the credit industry collectively spent $37.7 million in Congress, spread among both Democrats and Republicans alike. Different versions of the bill passed early in 2001, and President Bush reassured the industry of his unwavering support. Senator Russ Feingold, you notice how many Wisconsin connections there are in this story. Senator Russ Feingold called the bankruptcy bill the poster child for campaign finance reform, a telling assessment from a man who deals in the abuses of money and influence in Washington on a daily basis. But his point is a good one. It is otherwise hard to explain how a democratically elected legislature could favor a bill that would squeeze millions of families in order to increase or improve the bottom line for a very small, very profitable group of credit providers. The tragic events of September 11th have at least temporarily dampened enthusiasm for a bill that would eliminate the last safety net for many families facing layoffs. And the gift of billions of dollars to the airline industry has made it particularly difficult right now for Congress to squeeze harder on middle-class families and small businesses. But the respite may be brief. Wisconsin Congressman Sensenbrenner announced just yesterday that he will use his power to push the bill forward and tried to schedule a meeting for next week in order to be able to do that so that the bankruptcy bill can get back on track. The interesting question that I'm going to address, though, is why this bill wasn't already snugly in place before September 11th, 2001, or indeed September 11th, 1998. The credit industry was virtually the only one spending money, and it spent huge amounts of money. Despite the industry's making bankruptcy reform its #1 legislative agenda item, in 7 years of pushing on this bill, it didn't manage to turn its wish list into law. The industry may eventually prevail, but the delay to this point suggests that maybe something else is at work. What I propose is the delay has been sparked in part by a war over facts. An empirical question has slowed the process, changed some minds, raised some doubts, triggered some opposition, attracted a spotlight, and perhaps most importantly, taken away cover for those who would be willing to do the credit industry's bidding. The specific issue can be framed in a number of ways, but it centers on a central question about who uses the bankruptcy system and for what purpose. Do a bunch of slick operators who found yet another way to take advantage of all bill-paying, honest, hardworking Americans use bankruptcy to discharge debts they improvidently ran up and in fact could probably repay? Or does the system function as a last safety net for tens of thousands of middle-class families hit with job losses, medical bills, and ex-husbands who won't pay? Do politicians really care about the answer to the empirical question? Well, the cynics among us, and there may be many in this room, can dismiss the role of data. In Washington, money talks, and the credit industry is making campaign contributions. There are no debtor PACs out there. But even the most hardened politicians want a colorable argument to support their claims, especially if the media threaten to tell millions of readers or listeners that the legislation is, once again, a reward for contributors and hurts middle-class families. This means that a well-orchestrated effort for major legislative change is now accompanied by a public relations campaign. And here's the key I want you to see. The industry doesn't need to shape public opinion in order to get legislation and get the attention of someone in Congress. Money takes care of that. What the public relations campaign is there for is to shape public opinion to neutralize any opposition that would make it too difficult or too embarrassing for the lawmakers to support such legislation. Here is where the real market for data has emerged. By the mid-1990s, when the credit industry realized, as I'd said earlier, that the Bankruptcy Review Commission was not going to do its bidding, the industry had its lobbyists and it had its congressional sponsors for the bill. What the industry needed was a public relations campaign to show the media, and hence the public, that the bankruptcy bill was not special interest legislation. The heart of the PR campaign was allegedly neutral empirical research. In short order, the credit industry commissioned 3 empirical studies. They went to the accounting firm of Ernst & Young, to an economic data for hire group known as WEFA, and the now familiar Credit Research Center. Suddenly, there were 3 statistical studies bearing different logos, and they explained in turn the desperate need for this legislation. The information on how much the credit industry spent on these studies is proprietary, so we can't know. But you can gauge the magnitude of the effort if you spend any time talking to reporters. Reporters will say, by and large, that for years they have received a press package every week that explains the need for this legislation, and that they receive faxes nearly every day with some little snippet of how the law reads and why it is that this legislation should pass. Now, here's the fact I want to center on, just the facts. The message always returned to a central empirical claim, proof positive that the system was broken and hurting average citizens. The data proved it. The industry launched its public relations campaign with a blizzard of press releases that purported to show bankruptcy costs every American family $400. And I just realized that in my briefcase, I forgot to bring it up here, I have an ad, and it's not good enough to reproduce anyway, although I'm hoping it will be in the final published version. It's a full-page ad, and it shows a family holding sacks of groceries. And it says, what could you do with $400? And the answer is buy a month's worth of groceries. And it says that's what bankruptcy costs every American family, $400. Those ads ran in the Washington Post. They ran in newspapers around the country. By and large, they were centered in Washington. But the message was there. It was there publicly. It was there in every press release. Bankruptcy costs every American family $400. Interestingly enough, the Credit Research Center report had never actually said that bankruptcy costs every American family $400. They have some other data in there, but it's in an interview in the American Bankers Association magazine, one of my favorite reads. It is actually. There's a lobbyist who puffs that he's the one who actually came up with the $400 number. So we have someone who's already claimed credit. Nonetheless, the 1997 CRC report is always cited as the source of this research, or I say often cited. And the two are listed together in virtually every press release and often in the newspaper stories. So that I just was checking, do a Nexus search for $400 and bankruptcy within 50 words, and you will find that bankruptcy costs every American family $400, attributed to experts, Purdue University researchers, Purdue experts, Georgetown researchers, Georgetown experts, a study, a congressman, court records, and no one at all, because it's evidently just a well-known fact. At the time the fact was released, let's do a little math. About 1 million families a year were filing for bankruptcy. For 1 million families to repay enough to produce a benefit of $400 each, for 100 million American families in a single year, those 1 million bankruptcy families would have to repay $40 billion. You with me? Or about $40,000 apiece. On a median annual income of $22,000, this is going to be problematic. Moreover, the credit industry's own studies show that about 90% of those who are in bankruptcy, even though they say the system is shot through with abuse, either are already in repayment systems and making payments, or they're hopeless. There is no chance that they could repay anything. These are people below the poverty line and so on. So that actually leaves only 100,000 families to produce the $400 for each of the 100 million American families, or if you do the math, they need to come up with $400,000 apiece by being denied access to bankruptcy. Now, the industry never actually said it was going to pass along that $400 savings to each of its customers. And history would suggest that it would not. Let me just give you an example. I can't resist a couple of examples here. Credit card issuers' biggest cost is not bankruptcy. Bankruptcy is, in fact, a tiny fraction of total cost. Biggest cost is the cost of funds. They go borrow that money that they lend to people in the payment over time. So the single biggest question for the profitability of a credit card company is, what is the cost of funds? Between 1983 and 1991 in the US, and think about what was happening to inflation, the cost of funds for the credit industry dropped by 9 percentage points. That is, in effect, the wholesale cost of money dropped by 9 percentage points. What happened to the median interest rate on credit cards in the United States? Answer, rose by 2 points. So the spread in that period of time went up, which of course means the profitability went up. And I can't resist one more example. We've now seen 9 rate cuts this year. What's happened in the 9 rate cuts this year? The answer is the credit card companies have by and large kept most of the difference. The latest estimates are that there is about $10 billion that the credit card companies have retained because of the falling wholesale cost of the money that they have not passed on in this wildly competitive market to their customers. MBNA, just to pick a single example, its profits in the third quarter of 2001 are up 30% over its profits in the preceding quarter, even when seasonally adjusted, in the year 2001 alone. In other words, credit card issuers, this is a kind of key part of what works in here, they're not pricing at the margin for cost. There's ample evidence about this. Competition in this industry is based much more on marketing strategies, brand loyalty, and other devices that permit card issuers to reap profits that are, on average, more than twice as high as any other lending activity. That is, the credit card profits net of all expenses, including the bankruptcy losses, are more than double the profits of any other lender that operates in the United States. Based on current evidence, if the industry can squeeze more money out of families who otherwise would file for bankruptcy, shareholders will benefit, but not customers. Now, at the insistence of Brady Williamson, who was then chair of the National Bankruptcy Review Commission when this report was released, the Congressional Budget Office reviewed the credit industry studies. The CBO identified substantial methodological shortfalls in all of the work and cautioned in particular that the Credit Research Center study, quote, gives a misleading indication of the amount of losses that creditors could hope to recover under the proposed legislation. Subsequent reviews by the General Accounting Office reached similar conclusions about the creditor-sponsored data. The key point, though, is that the difficulties with the $400 per family or $40 billion in the economy generally, the difficulties with this claim arise at so many levels that anyone with a critical eye and a rudimentary knowledge of basic mathematics would have been deeply skeptical of the claim. And yet, not a single news report of the $400 fact raised either question whether a group of bankrupt debtors could produce that kind of money or whether or not the banks would actually pass any of it on to their customers. Instead, the fact was simply stated and restated, creating a seemingly irrefutable basis for bankruptcy reform. That, no doubt, was the sponsor's intent. The market for data, like any other market, uses signals to determine the quality of the product. One way to signal quality is by the prestige of the person or the institution offering the data. It was no accident that the credit industry commissioned the Credit Research Center to conduct a study. In the mid-1990s, the Credit Research Center relocated from Purdue University to Georgetown. Instead of being in the Midwest, churning out data far from its target audience, the center could operate out of Georgetown University, close to those who could and would use the data in the public policy arena. The director of the center, Dr. Michael Staten, could make himself available on short notice to visit with staffers or testify before congressional committees. The center touts, if you think this is a harsh assessment on my part, look at their website. Their website says, location in the nation's capital provides outstanding access to policymakers and researchers within the federal government, as well as numerous think tanks, associations, and universities in or near the greater Washington area. In other words, by moving to Washington, the CRC could be not more effective at producing data, but more effective at marketing data. The 1997 CRC study of bankruptcy carries no disclaimer about the source of the funding, nor does the website that weaves the CRC in with its other academic programs at Georgetown. Instead, the name Georgetown University appears prominently at the beginning of the paper documents and on every electronic page about the center on its website. The CRC's director is identified as distinguished professor, McDonough School of Business, Georgetown University, on the Georgetown website. But the website has something I've never seen before, at least I've never seen it in an academic website, and that is it indicates that this particular professor reports to a 14-member governing board of the Credit Research Center. Dr. Staten refers to his board as a who's who of credit grantors. And indeed, it includes the largest credit card issuers in the country. Credit research industry sources supply almost all of the Credit Research Center's $450,000 annual budget, including the director's salary. I leave it to you to judge the effect, if any, of donations the Credit Research Center received on the content of the research it produced. The CRC director denies any bias in his work, noting that he can operate independently of those who pay for the studies. I make only an empirical observation. As far as I can tell, the Credit Research Center, funded by the credit industry, has never produced a single piece of work at odds with a credit industry position, while it has produced numerous works that call for more pro-creditor, anti-debtor legislation. Always these calls are made in the name of independent academic research. The symbiotic relationship is mirrored in other academic institutions and other fields. The University of Maine has a lobster institute that is funded by the seafood industry. It sponsors research that shows, among other things, that lobsters don't suffer when they're boiled alive. I'm not kidding, look it up. The Carnegie Mellon University study identified more than 1,000 corporate-sponsored university institutes in the sciences and technology alone. I want to make a different point about this, though. Funding a center with annual donations and special contributions for specific research is very different from funding a center with an endowment that the university itself administers. Both may promote work in a certain field, but it's the annual contribution that keeps a researcher on a very short leash. If work is produced that funders find incompatible with their political and public relations goals, it's easy for the funders to refuse any future support. This is a harsh reality of which any center or institute dependent on annual giving will be acutely aware. My task here is not to engage in investigative reporting about the relationship between industry-funded research centers and their university hosts. My dean back at Harvard will be glad of that. This observation, though, is to illustrate how the market for data, it's to get one piece in how the market for data works. And now I want to turn and focus a bit more on this market for data. The market has changed the availability of for-hire studies. They've blossomed. There are many of them. I pick one to shine my light on. But that's what's happened. The spoonful of data, we're looking for it. There are now people who will produce it for money. The point, though, is that it also has changed what happens to independent studies. I've written a long section in this paper for the written version of it about how private funding affects public support for research and influences the internal university dynamic for supporting research. But in the limited time I have to talk to you, I want to focus on three other aspects about the effects of a market for data that might not be quite so obvious. The presence of industry-sponsored data changes the rules of independent research, the methods of dissemination of information, and the form of critique. Let me go through these. Changing the rules of research. The terms of my first National Science Foundation grant required that we release all of our data, my co-authors and I. And my co-authors and I continue to do that to this day, even when it's not required by a funding agency. For any of you who are familiar with empirical work, you know that this is pretty standard. It permits other people to test the data, check out the robustness of the data, cross-examine it, and build on it for other kinds of research because it's all there. It also, to be perfectly blunt, is the academically honest thing to do. It's what people do. Of course, it takes time to put a data set in order so that you can let a stranger look at it. If you don't want to let strangers plow through the drawers of your dresser, believe me, you don't want them plowing through your database either because it's always a little untidy. But you get it together. By contrast, the Credit Research Center describes the data it produces as proprietary, belonging to Visa and MasterCard. The data are therefore unavailable to anyone else for any purpose, and MasterCard and Visa give prior approval to all disclosures of the data. For the CRC to make a claim for data that bear the name and imprimatur of a well-respected research institution changes the ground rules for everyone. If the CRC, using its university affiliation, produces data that are literally owned by a credit card company, then the market signals that come from university affiliation are rendered meaningless. I draw an unhappy conclusion from this. Data packaged and sold to a willing public under university imprimatur may or may not be reputable. For anyone who does independent academic research, who has little to trade in but her independence and her reputation, the idea that the market for data has devalued the signal for independence and for quality, that is, devalued what it means to have university affiliation, is deeply discouraging. My second point about how it changes things. It changes how work is disseminated. For a study that's never been published in any academic journal or book, the conclusions of the Credit Research Center's study on bankruptcy have received a staggering amount of attention. References have appeared in press releases, they're part of press packages, they've been read into the congressional record, the author has testified before Congress. It's an expensive process to spread the word on empirical research, but an interested group has done just that with the CRC study. A few years ago, I got a call from a reporter who wanted me to comment on the pending bankruptcy bill. When I explained that I thought the bill was badly misdirected and I cited empirical research about who uses the system, the reporter actually got very aggravated with me. He demanded to know why he hadn't heard about this research. He had been working on the story for nearly a week. He had interviewed more than a dozen people, and he had read several papers and studies. If I was right about the presence of other research, then why hadn't he uncovered it in his work? I was really tired when this guy called. It was already early evening. I looked forward to 2 to 3 more hours of class prep so I could be ready for the next morning. I had already spent a half an hour with him trying to walk him through the statute, trying to walk him through the proposed legislation, and trying to explain what the data show, when he exploded on me with this thinly veiled suggestion that I was somehow making all of this up. With some heat, I asked him to think back on the preceding week. Was it just possible that every single person he talked with had been paid to talk to him? Was it possible that every single piece of paper on his desk had been generated by someone who was paid to generate that piece of data? Was it possible that a whole cadre of people out there held jobs that were to do nothing but make sure he got favorable data and to do nothing to help him get any data that were unfavorable? Was that just a possibility about how his research had gone over the last week? I took it as a small victory that he was quiet. Now, I'm a person of no small enthusiasm for my work. Give me another hour each day and I will probably find a way to spend 80 minutes of it working. Like most of you, I'm great on quantitative. Like most of you, I have more research ideas than I do time to execute. In the past 4 years, I have spent an average of an hour a day talking to reporters or talking to staffers. I've taken calls while I was on vacation in Alaska, while I was sick with pneumonia, and while I was baking a birthday cake. My dean would note that since I spend time with reporters year-round, it adds up to about twice as many minutes as I actually spend in the classroom. I began this paper with the observation that those who care about influencing policy outcomes, rather than simply influencing other academics, should be attracted to empirical research. But the competition in an active market for research changes the influence that such research could have. For research to make it into the mainstream of ideas, it now must not only be published, it needs an advocate to promote it. I've never written a press release or sent my work unsolicited to a reporter, but I recognize that it's becoming increasingly unlikely that academic studies that are not actively promoted are unlikely to have any real effect. For those without access or without the inclination to do that kind of self-promotion, some work will simply not be heard. And the third thing that happens, it changes the form of critique. In 1998, Congressman George Gekas issued a press release promoting his sponsorship of the pending bankruptcy bill and proclaiming, you guessed it, that bankruptcy costs every American family $400. I'm a good citizen and a serious researcher, so I called his office and I said, where'd you get that number? Because I think it might be wrong. And I gave some of the reasons why, offered some alternative data, some other ways to look at this. Person on the other end said, we'll get right back to you. So when they didn't get back, I called. I called again and I called again. I think I called a total of about a half a dozen times, and I'm still waiting. But in the meantime, Congressman Gekas continued to issue press releases and be quoted in the press as citing that fact that bankruptcy costs every American family $400. Now, remember the name, remember the story for just 1 minute. Not everyone fell for the $400 story. In the May 15th, 2000 issue of Time magazine, Pulitzer Prize-winning reporters Don Bartlett and Jim Steele published a 12-page report about the pending bankruptcy legislation. Under the title, Soaked by Congress, they focused on the powerful connection between campaign contributions and the pending bankruptcy legislation. The piece cited a number of studies that, as they described it, underscore why the notion that debtors in bankruptcy court are sitting on many billions of dollars that they could turn over to their creditors is a figment of the imagination of lenders and lawmakers. They gave the credit industry and congressional supporters their say, liberally quoting the bill's sponsors, pegging the cost at $400 for every American family. Bartlett and Steele, however, had their own take. There is only one problem with all this rhetoric. They said, it is not true. The $400 fact, as I pointed out earlier, has never raised a flicker of a question in the media. But when Bartlett and Steele's piece appeared in Time magazine, the gates of hell opened wide. Congressman Gekas was now shocked to discover inaccuracies in the bankruptcy debate. In a letter to Time, this is true, he charged that the article was full of blatant misrepresentations. Senators took to the floor of the Senate to denounce the Time magazine article, bringing others to their feet in support. The American Bankruptcy Institute sponsored a spirited exchange about accuracy in the media, focused on the Time magazine article, not on the $400 that bankruptcy costs every American family. Credit industry lobbyists were so outraged by the Time article, they put together a 7-page, single-spaced list of the inaccuracies in the Bartlett and Steele report. Now, this would be laughable, except that an excerpt of this list appeared verbatim as the original work of Congressman Menendez that he circulated on his official congressional stationery to all members of the House and Senate. Senators Charles Grassley and Joe Biden, co-sponsors of the bill, also wrote a letter to the whole Senate decrying, quote, the bias and inaccuracies in the Time magazine article, and reasserting, watch it, that bankruptcy costs are passed on to others, although they decided not to mention a specific number. Even the National Review got into the picture, attacking Bartlett and Steele for their article for junk journalism. Now, did this mean that Congress and the media had suddenly found a religion on the question of accuracy on the data? Not quite, because throughout this whole debate, no one raised a question about the $400. Indeed, Senator Torricelli continued to claim throughout the debate, and the reason we know it's wrong is because bankruptcy costs every American family $400. Long after the dust-up in the Time magazine story is gone, the $400 lives on. As recently as September of this year, another newspaper carried a short piece on bankruptcy, including the fact that bankruptcy costs every American family $400. Now, this might all be entertaining or merely a cautionary tale for those of you who read the popular news, but an empirical researcher hears this story with a very different ear. There are two messages. Data that have political support and a strong public relations campaign will be used over and over, regardless of their accuracy. Data that do not support the prevailing view will simply be attacked. The effects of such a market for data are not subtle. I'll identify one. When we discuss various technical twists in our data, Dr. Sullivan, who is my sociologist co-author, repeatedly demands that we turn square corners, spending far more time and far more of our limited resources to track down tiny anomalies or slight shifts in how we draw a sample. It is her stated goal to make our work absolutely unassailable, its statistical validity unquestioned. When I complain that nobody would notice, it will make no real statistical difference, that this is a waste of time, she never relents. She reminds me that thanks to my own loud mouth, there are plenty of people who are ready to pounce on every number we produce. While I appreciate Dr. Sullivan's efforts to keep our collective skirts clean, the reality is far less rational than she supposes. Last year, Judge Edith Jones of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals and Professor Todd Zwicky, a former Fifth Circuit clerk, and now at George Mason University, wrote an article, a law review article, to support the pending legislation. They faced the academic studies head on. Our data, carefully patrolled by Dr. Sullivan, were dismissed variously as ideologically driven, overwrought, nonsense, shallow empiricism, and my personal favorite, bizarre. Judge Jones and Professor Zwicky used strong language to attack my co-authors and my work. Interestingly, however, they have not a single word of criticism for the research methods. Not one quibble over how we drew our studies or designed the samples or how we collected our data. There's not a word of criticism about the analysis of the data or the inferences that we draw from the data. Instead, it's just a broadside attack on the conclusions. For example, our data demonstrate a strong statistical association between medical problems and bankruptcy filings. Instead of specific methodological critique, however, Judge Jones and Professor Zwicky simply reject wholesale the careful statistical analysis of 1,500 debtors as, quote, little more than hand-waving and faculty lounge speculation, perhaps rooted in ideological biases, but most definitely not scientific evidence. I've been at the center of 5 major empirical projects. the description of a helicopter as 20,000 bolts flying in loose formation would also apply to an empirical study. There are hundreds of judgments, unexpected twists, opportunities to make good faith errors that could bring the whole thing down. Every publication based on a detailed quantitative study has the breathtaking moment when you have to turn loose of the data and let them be published, and to be out there to rebuke you forever if there is a mistake in what it is that you've done. I understand that the search for perfection in data gathering is elusive. I read empirical work with a deeply sympathetic eye, but I have been very critical, but only when errors are so many and seem always to tilt in the same direction. I am also willing to subject my own work to the critical eye of others and to question hundreds of choices I've made. It's only through the process of analysis and reanalysis, critique and response, that we refine our understanding of the subjects we study. The line I'm trying to draw here is a fine one. Any threat of criticism, whether from academics or politicians, provides a healthy incentive to take extraordinary care with data, and it should be embraced. But the attack of a federal judge and another law professor, dismissing years of work as merely ideological or perhaps even dishonest, is not about refining our understanding of the study of the subjects that we study. The debate has changed. This is about political warfare, in which data are merely one of many weapons. Anyone deeply concerned about maintaining his or her reputation, or more interested in spending time on research rather than on name-calling, would be well advised to stay out of an area with a well-developed market for data. Now I'm going to bring this argument to full circle, about time, right, and then quit. The market for data produces industry studies, but it creates an anti-market that says all studies are useless. I'll return again to Judge Jones and Professor Zwicky. As they endorsed the bankruptcy legislation, they grappled with conflicting empirical studies. You have a sense of their view of the academic data. The credit industry studies, which have been criticized by the GAO and the CBO, received not a single word of criticism from Judge Jones and Professor Zwicky. Even so, they seem to have this nagging concern that they may not have fully resolved the empirical question and made an entirely compelling case. So to deal with that problem, they take another approach. This is a quote from their article. Whether the studies were done by creditor-funded academics and accounting firms or by ideologically motivated academics is ultimately irrelevant and mutually canceling. It seems that in the new marketplace for empirical data, independent academic work not only competes with industry-funded work, it also gets thrown out along with it when the two are in conflict. All data are created equal. Judge Jones and Professor Zwicky feel no responsibility to weigh the data, to examine the research methods or the study design or the statistical reports. Instead, they simply announce that if there is a difference, all of the data are mutually canceling. It seems that in an active market for data, all data are equally valuable, valueless, and can be discarded. Now, the Jones-Zwicky view resonates throughout the academy as well. University of Chicago professor Douglas Baird has argued that different theoretical frames of reference will never be resolved by empirical research because the adherents are simply asking different questions. Professor Baird explains, first-rate empirical work has, of course, been done. It has also changed the way that some have thought about bankruptcy law. Nevertheless, it would be a mistake to think that empirical studies will do much to end the current debates. The messy world of bankruptcy cannot yield empirical data powerful enough to change minds to the extent that they embrace a different set of axioms. Professor Baird makes a telling point about respected academics who, rather than captured by an interest group, are captured by a paradigm. In discussing debates among bankruptcy scholars, he argues that empiricists are unlikely ever to produce evidence so compelling that people acting in good faith would learn enough to modify their theoretical positions. He relies on Bayesian decision-making theory to make the point that even those who do not close their eyes to data are unlikely to be persuaded by data that do not fit their paradigms. If he describes reality, then he describes a world in which academics are far more wedded to theory than to evidence, even if evidence were available. The origin of their prejudice may be benign, but the message is not unlike the one overtly adopted by Judge Jones and Professor Zwicky. Don't bother me with the facts. The anti-data movement picks up steam when critics point out the ambiguity that always lies within empirical data. In criticizing another empirical study focusing on the reasons that people file for bankruptcy, researchers Gordon Vermont and Ed Flynn describe an impenetrable network of interconnected factors that are plausible causes for bankruptcy. Using the example of whether divorce causes bankruptcy, they argue data are always subject to a different interpretation that is not refutable by the numbers themselves. It's an accurate statement. But that they then jump from the fact of indeterminacy to radical indeterminacy. They go on to say, studies about the cause of bankruptcy provide ambiguous or insufficient guidance for answering bankruptcy policy questions. In other words, because we do not know everything, we know nothing. Data are meaningless, not even helpful for guidance in answering policy questions. They also seem to suggest that good studies and bad studies should be treated alike since they draw no distinction among them. An active market for data has created the opportunity, the framework for ignoring all data from multiple perspectives, whether as a committed advocate, a scholar who embraces a different theoretical paradigm, or a researcher who sees only the ambiguities. All data can be dismissed with ease. The market creates the anti-market. Policymakers are free to proceed to legislation without need to think about the pesky data. The world is not as Peter Schuck described it in 1989. There exists an eager, even aggressive audience for empirical research and an active market for that research. That market has changed the work. Data have become more political and therefore at once both more in demand and less important. The data are mutually canceling. I believe there are some objective facts and hence some objective truths. Whether public policy reflects reality is not our choice to make in the academy, but producing and protecting research itself is not only our choice, it is, in my view, our moral obligation. Despite all the reasons not to do empirical research, such research persists and perhaps, like tough weeds, seems to be multiplying. Also, like weeds, it's probably been affected by the hostile climate in which it grows. In any case, there is evidence that academics will continue to supply at least some of the raw materials. But the gap between developing the studies and influencing the public policy is wider than ever. Schuck suggested the first step, empiricists need to produce data. But the second step, a sort of assumed if we build it, they will come, becomes increasingly unlikely in a market dominated by industry interests. Everyone in this room should care about the developments I have described. Your Congress, your legislature, your city council, your fellow citizens, and you will be affected by data and pseudo-data in all manner of public policy debates. When universities lend their names to the production of proprietary data owned by its industry sponsors, they sell not only their good names, but your good name. They cheapen what each of us, empiricist and non-empiricist alike, has to offer in a policy discussion. And when you fail to draw careful distinctions among data, when you glance casually instead of carefully at empirical work, when you fail to respond to pseudo-research, you further destroy the foundation of good social science. If bad studies and good studies pass with equal inattention within the academy, then Gresham's law will kick in, and only industry-friendly data will survive. The people in this room are in the vanguard of policing the market for data. The market for data threatens the role that social science research can play in policy making. When data become a commodity, purchased, packaged, and sold to a willing public under a university imprimatur by those who profit from its distribution, then empirical work is little more than cheap ad copy. When that happens, the value of every kind of research that academics do declines sharply. Like it or not, our collective worth is now on the line.
Thank you very much. I don't remember, don't know whether you remember this guy from your prior visits to the law school, but it is our uniquely threatening and ugly symbol. It's the gargoyle. The real version is out there in the hall, but we would like to present this to you as a memento and a thank you for those really wonderful remarks.
Thank you.
And we will also ship it to you, so you don't need to worry about getting this guy back in.
I'm not sure you can take that through
I think,
security right now.
The number of different checkpoints that this guy would violate.
That's right. That's right. I think they even ask about whether you have sharp teeth as you go through now.
I'll put him back here behind the judge, and I think all of us can see why you won that whole train full of teaching awards. That was fantastic. Professor Warren has agreed to take some questions, and I just need to ask you to be patient because we're broadcasting this to overflow rooms. We're going to pass around a mic so that your questions can be heard in the various rooms, and Scott here will be the official bearer of the microphone. So.
That was short.
Considering that just this afternoon the AP reported that the Surgeon General will in fact be resigning, in part because the Bush administration dismissed his August report, citing data on the value of abstinence training as being meaningless because he was in fact the Surgeon General for the previous administration. I wonder if you have any observations about the third area of data generation that you've not talked about a lot, and that's government sources of data and situations that render it useful, non-useful, credible, and incredible.
I don't. Other than I will make only a small comment because it's so far outside my area of expertise. I talk about the little area of the world I know about. But I will say that two things have struck me powerfully with the government researchers who do the tiny little bit of work in the bankruptcy area, and it is tiny. The reason I do many of the studies I do is because the government doesn't do them. I find it as utterly remarkable that we can find out to the nearest tenth of an inch how much rainfall fell in Deer Creek, Oklahoma in 1957, but we have no idea how much debt was discharged in bankruptcy in any year in our history. We simply don't collect the data, so that's a big part of why I do what I do. But the little bit I've seen has left me only with two comments. There are some sincerely hardworking government researchers who are very talented and who are sitting on a wealth of data, and I have been shocked to see how much they are not able to do with that data, how the politics seem to be the whole game. I respect the people that I've had reason to deal with, but it has been perfectly clear to me that they don't do more because at some level in their hierarchical structure, data are very threatening. You can't know in advance how they're going to come out. And so it is better simply not to have the studies, not to do the research, not to do the work. And I'll actually finger the Administrative Office of the United States Courts, who sits on exactly the kind of data I'm talking about. They have a wealth of these data that lawyers are required to report to them and are now required to put into a certain form. Courthouses have to gather it. The clerks in the courthouses have to spend substantial resources gathering it. And it all flows into Washington, only to have someone make the political decision that the only piece of information that will be published is the number of filers and the chapter in which they filed and the number of cases that were closed, and nothing more. So I do not have great enthusiasm that this is going to be our source, at least in my field, of powerful information. Yes, sir.
Professor, just if we could get to the mic here.
I'm Michael Lefko. Professor, when I started as a legal service lawyer in 1966 in Chicago, one of my first cases was someone who came in with a contract which charged over 6%, which was the usury law in Illinois at the time. And I'm wondering, has any study been done which would show the effect of lifting the usury laws on the number of bankruptcies that have been filed? And is this a matter or an area of interest to you?
It's, for those of you who don't know, what's so marvelous about the usury story is that every state in the Union had powerful usury laws, very strong usury laws. As you say, 6% in some places. It was 9% in Arkansas up until 1981. And it was unlawful to lend money at an interest rate in excess of that. Indeed, in many states, the consequence of doing that could not only subject the lender to fines, but the whole debt would be wiped out. So you not only didn't have to pay the interest at the usurious rate, you didn't even have to pay the underlying principal, was one of the ways that this area was policed. What happened? In 1978, there was a decision, Supreme Court decision, in which the court decided in interpretation of a federal statute that a bank, I'll give you the example, a bank in California could lend money to a customer in Nevada and use the California interest rate rather than the Nevada interest rate for usury. That, wrong? Oh, yeah, wow, exactly. I thought you said wrong. Hold on, Lordy, whole generations of people are going to have this wrong. Okay, but yeah, that's what they decided. Now, here's what's cool. It took most people a little longer to get the wow than you did. About 15 months went by, and South Dakota said, wow, our interest rate is now 32%. And Citibank said, South Dakota, sunny skies, complicitous workforce, good usury laws. And so Citibank moved to South Dakota. Delaware said, well, we could do that. We could drop ours to 40, or raise ours to 40%. And so that's the name of the game. So we effectively deregulated usury throughout the United States in just about, depends on your game here, but about 1980, 1981 is when the states just instantly fall into line, and all the credit card issuers. You think you have if anyone here has a Sears credit card, you think Sears has issued that credit card? Sears Bank, that is in one of the states that has high usury rates. That's how it is that it can charge 23% on its card in Massachusetts, even though Massachusetts has one of those low usury rates now of 22%. So what's happened, I'll tell you exactly how I see it and tee it up in some of my work. That's what it is that has permitted us to produce the spread. And that's what I was talking about earlier in the paper. The wholesale cost of money from 1981 to today has been a line down, because Alan Greenspan finally got inflation under control, or you can decide what you think are the reasons. But the wholesale cost of money went down, and the retail cost, that is the credit card, went down a little, went back up as we're going into subprime, but it stayed very high. That created a gap between the wholesale and the retail. It's known as the spread in the trade, that made it so profitable to lend to consumers that money, you should almost be able to hear it at night out on the prairie as money whooshes into consumer credit lending out of every other form, because it is so highly profitable. What it has also done is it has meant, who is the profitable customer? Well, let me give you a little hint. 85% of the revenues of credit card companies come from people who make minimum monthly payments. They don't come from that discount, the 3% from the store and all that sort of jazz. It all comes from people who make minimum monthly payments. So who's your most profitable customer? The guy who looks just like the guy who goes bankrupt, except doesn't. It's not me. I'm not the profitable customer. Indeed, in this whole system, I'm the free rider in the system because I don't pay any interest. The people who are making the minimum monthly payments, my nephew, who is in his 7th year at the University of Oklahoma. It's a tough school. And making those minimum monthly payments every month on his credit card, that's the kid who they're all looking for. That's the kid who's the real profit center. And it all ties back into this game. If we wanted to cut our bankruptcy filing rate in half, I know 2 ways we could do it, in the blink of an eye. I really do. If we would go to usury laws again, and this time we'll be a little fancier than we were before. Just put it as a floating rate on top of the prime or the T-bill or wherever you want to put it. 10 points, make it big. But what it will do is it will mean that it becomes less profitable to look for already impaired borrowers. And that will change the calculation of who gets into so much trouble on debt that they end up more likely in bankruptcy. The other way you could do it would be if we would expand health care and make health care protection available to more families. It would be the other way to cut bankruptcy filing rates. So yes, I think it's a big part of it. I think it's terribly important. It's a part of my research and part of the research of others, and right now no one is interested in that answer.
Not even Georgetown.
Not even Georgetown. No, that's right, a good Catholic university. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Would you comment further on the prospects for the new bankruptcy so-called reform in terms of will it actually go through? And I would like to hear more about why it's taken 7 years. I know you mentioned the OMB, and I'm somewhat aware of some of the work that's been done by the Bankruptcy Institute, but still, number one, I mean, first part of my question is why hasn't it gone through? And the second part is, will it really go through after the September 11 and the insecurity people feel about the economic prospects?
Well, part of the reason it hasn't gone through, I mean, you're exactly right to tee it up that way. All the money is on one side, all the influence, all of the power. This is one that's not close to a level playing field. Part of the reason sitting back there, Brady Williamson, took the position in leading the commission that the Bankruptcy Commission was not just there to endorse the views of the consumer credit industry. And while that seems really easy in the comfort of this room to take that position, taking that position with 8 other politically appointed commissioners and the strong views held by some who were commissioners that it was appropriate to shut down these abuses in bankruptcy, it was a very, very hard fight. So that's part of the answer, is the commission held it up until the end of 97, basically getting into 98. Then part of what happened is like anything. All the people who worked together during the commission kind of formed their own independent ragtag group. Brady and I talk on the phone, 9 times a day? And began to continue to push. And here's the bottom line. The facts really are on our side on this. This is really, really terrible legislation. And what's happened, sort of one newspaper reporter at a time, one congressman at a time, one senator at a time, is that a few people have gotten the message and been willing to throw themselves in front of the train to stop the legislation. Paul Wellstone basically has taken the position that he will simply stand on the railroad tracks. And it may cost him big time. But for him, it's sort of the ultimate populist legislation. You can't do that to what is now 1.4 million families. The other way I would just say to describe this is that the question about when it will pass, I feel like I've been living since 1995 on this little ledge. You know, these cartoon things, you know, when you're on this ledge and the earth will kind of shift and more of it will crumble away from underneath. The bill would go forward, it would make it out of committee, and you'd feel a few more rocks slip out from underneath your feet. Now we're, of course, in a terrible position. It's passed the House, it's passed the Senate, not in the same forms. It's ready to go to conference. And Sensenbrenner from Wisconsin is the person who is the chair of the conference. And right now it is my understanding, now I'll go to the second half of your question, that no one on the conference has an appetite to go forward on this bill. It just couldn't be a worse time to stand out in front and say, billions for the airlines, but nothing for the families who are laid off, and certainly no bankruptcy protection for them. But Sensenbrenner is pushing. It's all over. I checked my emails an hour before I left that Sensenbrenner wants a meeting and he's going to push this forward and this is going to be part of his agenda. So I would like to say it's really up to you folks here in Wisconsin. All up to you what's going to happen with the bill. And beyond that, I always say I don't do the politics. I don't know what's going to happen. I just don't know. I wish I had a better answer. Yes, sir.
It comes as no surprise that universities are falling all over themselves seeking private sources of money to support their research enterprises. and the phenomenon of a race to the bottom in terms of willingness to merchandise one's imprimatur creates a collective risk. In the part of the world that I study, which touches more pharmaceuticals and healthcare devices, there has been an increasing amount of evidence that sponsors of research seek to suppress research that comes out in ways they're not very happy with, and we're seeing an increasing number of fights over researchers either desiring to publish research and being held back by contractual limits, or simply understanding the shortness of their leash and not pursuing information that they know will make them unpopular. I'm curious whether you've given thought at this point to good practices or institutional approaches that can distinguish the signal of those sources of data that are not so amenable to manipulation or withholding or suppression, and ways in which universities, scholarly groups, professional associations can try to assure some signaling vehicle as to their adherence to standards that make them less amenable to that sort of manipulation and make their signal worthwhile, in contrast to the increasing number of places that are obviously for sale.
Your question is a serious question, and we're about to head to cocktails. So here's what I want to say, because I think it's more important to say. The answer is, yeah, I've started to think about it. I maybe have a hold of, one tiny little piece of the puzzle that grows out of the part I've seen. But I want to make a very different point. This should be the issue for academic institutions and for serious academics for the next decade. If we don't solve this problem together, then I'm very serious about what I said. You can't take the position that if you don't do research, you don't have a dog in this fight. You do have a dog in this fight, because it is the good name of the universities, and in turn, our good names as faculty members and people who live in those universities, that is on the line. And so what I'll say, and I'm going to make this the last question so we can all go drink together. What I'll say is this really has to be our agenda. It has to be more than a 5-minute answer from me. It has to be more than one much too long talk by me. It has to be the subject of days and of committees within universities and of presentations and, quite frankly, of news stories. There's one tiny little story in the Wall Street Journal about the Credit Research Center. And I'll tell you if you turn off the camera, I stayed on that reporter's tail for 3 solid months to get him to look at those data and to do something about university-sponsored research and looking at the Credit Research Center as an example of that. One article, and they sweated down one of the associate deans at Georgetown University enough to say, well, it gave him some comfort that the money came from 40 or 50 different credit grantors. Not kidding. That was his quote. How that person can still be at Georgetown University, how I can have colleagues at Georgetown University, you get my view on this. This one has to be our agenda. This is really what it's about. I want to say one last thing. It's a pleasure, truly, to be here. It's a pleasure to be at the University of Wisconsin, as it always is. I could talk to you guys forever, and in fact, give me a couple of drinks, and I probably will. I'm very, very glad to be here. And I just want to say one more time, I am doubly glad to be here when I have the opportunity to do it in honor of Judge Fairchild. It's been my pleasure to be here.